Frank Carson had spent 67 years on his family's corn farm in the rolling hills of western Iowa, his calloused hands and wind-etched face bearing witness to a lifetime of dawn to dusk labor. The locals in Riverview County knew him as Steady Frank, the quiet widower whose ancient pickup truck could be seen bouncing along rural routes in every kind of weather. He was the farmer who always had time to help a neighbor with a broken tractor or donate his harvest surplus to the county food pantry. But nothing in his decades of quiet rural life could have prepared him for how one split-second decision during a violent summer storm would thrust him into the center of national security and change his life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early morning fog clung to the cornfields like a ghostly blanket as Frank made his usual inspection rounds. The stalks stood tall and proud, nearly ready for harvest, their emerald husks glistening with dew that soaked the cuffs of his worn jeans as he walked the perimeter of the eastern field. His border collie, Pepper, trotted faithfully beside him, occasionally darting ahead to investigate interesting scents before returning to Frank's side. At sunrise, Frank's farm transformed into a canvas of golden light and long shadows. The weathered red barn, the two-story farmhouse with its wraparound porch, the silver grain silos standing like sentinels against the horizon, all of it painted in the warm hues of daybreak. This was the view that had greeted Frank every morning for over 6 decades, ever since he was a boy following his father through these same fields. The consistency of it provided a comfort that city folk might never understand. "Another good day, Pepper," Frank murmured, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Crops looking fine this year." In the distance, the farmhouse stood just as it had when his grandparents built it in 1932. It had weathered dust storms, tornadoes, and blizzards, much like Frank himself. The white paint was fading again, and the south-facing shutters needed repair, but the sturdy structure remained a testament to generations of Carson resilience. Frank had shared that house with his wife Eleanor for 42 years, until cancer claimed her 3 summers ago. Now it was just him and Pepper rattling around in rooms filled with memories and the gentle tick of the grandfather clock Eleanor had inherited from her family. Frank checked his watch, an old Timex that had survived decades of hard work, and noted it was nearly time for his morning coffee. He whistled to Pepper and turned back toward the house, his gait unhurried but purposeful. The weatherman on the local radio station had mentioned possible thunderstorms rolling in by afternoon, which meant he needed to secure the new irrigation equipment he'd left out yesterday. Inside the kitchen, Frank moved with the efficient rhythm of someone who had performed the same routine countless times. Coffee grounds measured precisely into the percolator, 2 slices of homemade bread into the toaster, Pepper's food scooped into her bowl. The radio on the countertop crackled with the morning farm report as Frank glanced through yesterday's mail that he hadn't had time to open. Severe thunderstorm watch has been issued for Riverview and surrounding counties, the meteorologist announced between market updates. Potential for heavy rainfall, damaging winds and quarter-sized hail beginning early afternoon and continuing through evening hours. Frank gazed out the window at the cloudless blue sky, skepticism etched in the lines around his eyes. He'd lived through enough Iowa summers to know that weather forecasts were educated guesses at best. Still, it wouldn't hurt to be prepared. He had planned to drive into town for supplies anyway. He could pick up extra batteries for the flashlights and make sure the generator had enough fuel. As he sipped his coffee, Frank's thoughts drifted to his military service, something he rarely dwelled on these days. Before returning to take over the family farm, he had served as a search and rescue specialist with the Air Force, pulling downed pilots from jungles and mountains across Southeast Asia. Those years felt like they belonged to another lifetime, or perhaps even another person altogether. The skills he'd gained had occasionally proved useful during civilian emergencies, like when he'd helped locate the Henderson boy who'd gotten lost during a blizzard 10 years back, or when he'd stabilized Rachel Conway after her tractor accident, until the ambulance could arrive. But mostly, those memories remained tucked away, like the medals and photographs stored in a box in the attic. The telephone rang, its sharp jangle cutting through Frank's reminiscence. He crossed the kitchen and picked up the receiver, cradling it between ear and shoulder as he rinsed his coffee cup. "Carson residence," he answered simply. "Frank, it's Howard." Howard Jenkins had been Frank's neighbor to the west for 30 years, farming the adjacent 200 acres. "You seen this weather report? They're saying we might get hit hard this afternoon." "Just heard it," Frank confirmed. "Heading into town for some supplies before it rolls in. Need anything?" "Nah, we're set, but I wanted to give you a headsy." "Up. My nephew works at the weather station over in Cedar Rapids. Says they're tracking rotation in the system. Could spin up into something serious." Frank's skepticism faded slightly. Howard wasn't one for exaggeration, and his nephew Tom was. A meteorologist who'd been reliable in his predictions. "Appreciate the warning. I'll make sure everything's battened down when I get back from town." After hanging up, Frank moved with a bit more urgency, making a mental list of preparations. The storm cellar would need checking, flashlights testing, the portable radio finding. He'd lived through enough severe weather to have a system, and he followed it methodically. Within an hour, he had fed the livestock, secured loose equipment, and was backing his 1998 Ford pickup out of the barn, Pepper, sitting attentively in the passenger seat. The drive into Millerville, the small town that served as the community hub for the surrounding farms, took 20 minutes along winding country roads. As Frank drove, he noticed the western horizon had already begun to darken, a smudge of grey-blue. Against the otherwise clear sky, Howard's nephew might be right about this one, he thought. Main Street was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning, locals apparently heeding the weather warnings and stocking up. Frank nodded greetings to familiar faces as he entered Jordan's Hardware, where he picked up batteries, propane for his camp stove, and a replacement part for his weather radio that had been on back order. At the grocery store, he added a few non-perishables to his cart, though his pantry was already well stocked, a habit Eleanor had instilled in him long ago. "Storms coming in faster than they thought," Ed Miller announced as Frank checked out. Ed had owned Millerville Grocery for as long as anyone could remember and considered himself an unofficial town crier. National Weather Service just upgraded. The watch to a warning, saying it'll hit by 2 o'clock now, not 4. Frank glanced at his watch, just past 11. "Guess I'd better head back then." "Thanks for the update, Ed." The sky had transformed dramatically during Frank's short time in town. What had been a distant smudge was now an imposing wall of charcoal clouds marching eastward, occasional flashes of lightning visible even at this distance. Frank loaded his supplies into the truck and headed home, noting how the air had taken on that peculiar stillness that often preceded violent weather, a pressurized hush, as if the world were holding its breath. Pepper sensed the change too, growing restless in her seat, her usual relaxed demeanor replaced by alert vigilance. Frank reached over to pat her reassuringly. "It's all right, girl. We'll be home before it hits." The first fat raindrops began to strike the windshield when Frank turned onto the gravel road that led to his property. Within moments, those isolated drops transformed into a deluge so intense that he had to slow the truck to a crawl, windshield wipers struggling futilely against the onslaught. The darkness was unnatural for early afternoon. The landscape transformed into shadowy outlines, punctuated by brilliant flashes of lightning. Frank guided the pickup carefully into the barn just as the wind began to howl in earnest, the structure's wooden beams creaking in protest against the onslaught. "Come on, Pepper," he urged, grabbing his purchases and making a dash for the house. They were both soaked by the time they reached the porch, the rain driving sideways and finding its way beneath Frank's jacket collar. Inside, Frank methodically began implementing his storm preparations, filling containers with water, checking that flashlights worked, positioning the weather radio on the kitchen counter. The power flickered once, twice, then stabilized, though Frank knew it might not last. Rural electricity was always the first casualty of severe weather. The weather radio squawked with updates, the automated voice warning of a severe thunderstorm with potential for tornadic activity. Frank moved to the living room window, gazing out at the churning sky. The corn stalks bent nearly horizontal, under the force of the wind, and visibility had reduced to almost nothing, the perimeter of his property lost in sheets of driving rain. That's when he heard it, a sound distinct from the storm's fury, cutting through even the continuous rumble of thunder, a mechanical whine, high-pitched and irregular. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Somewhere overhead, Frank cocked his head, listening intently, recognition dawning in his eyes. An aircraft engine, and one in serious trouble. Frank moved to the front door. Pepper closed at his heels and stepped onto the covered porch. The sound grew louder, more desperate, the unmistakable whine of a struggling aircraft. Through a momentary break in the downpour, Frank caught a glimpse of it, a small jet, not much larger than a corporate aircraft, but with markings he couldn't identify at this distance. Its trajectory was erratic, altitude dropping rapidly, as it disappeared beyond the tree line that marked the eastern boundary of his property. The impact wasn't immediately visible, but Frank felt it, a vibration through the ground beneath his feet, followed seconds later by the dull sound of tearing metal. His search and rescue training kicked in automatically, decades-old instincts rising to the surface as if they'd never been dormant. Someone was down, possibly injured, definitely in danger given the worsening storm conditions. Frank hesitated, only long enough to grab his emergency medical kit, a professional-grade setup, far more comprehensive than most farmers would keep on hand, and his heavy-duty flashlight. "Stay, Pepper," he commanded firmly, knowing the dog would want to follow. This mission required focus and potentially both hands free. The rain struck his face like pellets as Frank headed toward his utility terrain vehicle parked in the small shed adjacent to the barn. The six-wheeled gator could navigate the muddy conditions far better than his pickup, its elevated chassis designed for precisely this kind of rough terrain. He secured his medical kit, pulled on a rain poncho, and set out toward the eastern tree line. Guided by his memory of the aircraft's trajectory and the faint glow that now emanated from beyond the trees, possibly fire, despite the rain. Driving through the cornfield would have been impossible a month from now, but the plants were still small enough that the gator could forge a path without causing significant damage. Frank navigated carefully, the vehicle's headlights barely penetrating the curtain of rain as he approached the tree line that separated his property from the federal conservation land beyond. The trees provided some shelter from the driving rain, but navigating between them required all of Frank's concentration. The glow grew brighter as he approached, and soon he could make out the downed aircraft amid a small clearing. It had plowed a furrow through the earth before coming to rest against a cluster of old oak trees, one wing sheared off, the fuselage remarkably intact given the conditions of the crash. Frank brought the gator to a stop 50 yards from the wreckage, assessing the situation with the measured calm of someone who had seen worse. No visible flames, but sparks occasionally shot from what appeared to be the electrical system near the cockpit. The aircraft itself was unlike any civilian plane Frank had encountered, sleek, with an unusually angular design that suggested specialized purpose rather than passenger transport. Military, almost certainly, though without clear branch identifiers. Grabbing his medical kit, Frank approached cautiously. The cockpit canopy had partially shattered but remained largely in place. Through the cracked glass, he could see a single figure slumped forward against the restraints, unmoving. The side of the fuselage bore a small insignia. Not the standard Air Force markings Frank knew from his service days, but something more subdued, almost intentionally nondescript. Finding the manual emergency release for the canopy, Frank carefully opened it, immediately hit by the acrid smell of electrical burning and aviation fuel. Inside, the pilot, a woman in her 30s with short dark hair, remained unconscious, a gash across her forehead, streaming blood down the side of her face. Her flight suit bore no name tag or rank insignia, just a simple patch with what looked like a stylized eagle. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Frank called over the storm's fury, reaching in to check her pulse, strong but rapid. "I'm going to get you out of there." The woman's eyes fluttered open, disorientation giving way to sharp focus as she registered Frank's presence. "The case," she mumbled, struggling against her restraints. "Secure the case first." "Let's worry about you first," Frank replied calmly, already assessing her for additional injuries. Beyond the head wound, her right arm hung at an unnatural angle, broken most likely, and a growing stain of blood darkened the flight suit near her left thigh, possibly shrapnel from the impact. "No," the pilot insisted with surprising force, her voice gaining strength. "Black attaché case, behind the seat. Top priority." Her eyes locked onto Frank's, intense and unwavering, despite her injuries. "Matter of national security." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the professional authority that transcended her current vulnerable state, triggered Frank's military instincts. He'd heard that tone before, from commanding officers insisting on mission parameters even in dire circumstances. Without questioning. Further, he leaned past her and located the case she'd mentioned, a sleek hard-shell attaché secured to the interior with specialized brackets. It took him a moment to release the locking mechanism, but the case came free, surprisingly heavy for its size. "Got it," he confirmed, setting it safely on the ground outside the aircraft. "Now, let's get you out of here." The extraction was complicated by the pilot's injuries and the continuing storm, which had intensified to near hurricane force winds. Frank worked methodically, stabilizing her neck and spine before carefully releasing the restraints and easing her from the cockpit. She bit back cries of pain, but remained conscious, her eyes constantly tracking the case as Frank moved her. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Allison Reed," she managed between clenched teeth as Frank secured her on a collapsible stretcher from his kit. "Who are you?" "Frank Carson," he replied simply, covering her with an emergency blanket to ward off shock. "Former Air Force search and rescue. You picked a hell of a day to go flying, Commander." A ghost of a smile crossed her pain-stricken face. "Wasn't exactly by choice." Her eyes darted to the sky, then back to Frank. "We need to move quickly. This wasn't mechanical failure." Before Frank could process that statement, a sound cut. Through the storm, a mechanical whirring distinct from thunder. He looked up, squinting through the rain, and caught glimpse of a dark shape hovering at the edge of visibility. A helicopter, its silhouette unfamiliar. Lieutenant Commander Reed followed his gaze, her expression hardening. "They found us. Faster than expected," she muttered, then fixed Frank with an intense stare. "Mr. Carson, I need your help. That's not a rescue team." Frank assessed the situation rapidly, decades of training crystallizing into decisive action. Whoever was in that helicopter, their appearance had clearly alarmed the injured pilot, whose credentials and aircraft already suggested classified operations. The storm offered limited visibility and would hamper the helicopter's ability to land precisely, buying them perhaps 10 minutes at most. "My vehicle's just beyond those trees," Frank informed her, securing the stretcher for transport. "Can you tell me who's after you?" "Not who you'd expect," Reed replied cryptically, grimacing as Frank lifted the stretcher. "People who shouldn't know about this flight or what I'm carrying. The fact they found us so quickly means we have a serious internal breach." Frank didn't press for details. In his military experience, knowing too much during an extraction could sometimes be as dangerous as knowing too little. What mattered was getting the injured pilot to safety and securing whatever was in that case that warranted such pursuit during a severe storm. The return journey to the gator was painstaking, Frank navigating carefully through mud and underbrush while protecting Reed from the worst of the elements. The black case, now secured in a waterproof bag from his kit, hung heavily from his shoulder. The distant helicopter seemed to be conducting a search pattern, its spotlight sweeping through the rain in gradually narrowing circles. "They're using thermal imaging," Reed observed, as Frank helped her into the passenger seat of the gator. "This storm is the only reason they haven't pinpointed us yet." Frank stowed the stretcher and climbed behind the wheel, plotting their route back to the farmhouse. The direct path through the cornfield would leave them exposed. Instead, he opted for the longer route that would keep them under tree cover as much as possible. "I have a storm cellar," he informed Reed as they began moving. "Concrete below, ground level, should mask any thermal signature." Reed nodded appreciatively, one hand clutching her injured arm, the other maintaining contact with the case now secured between them. "Smart thinking. We need to stay hidden until I can establish secure communications. I had equipment in the aircraft, but..." She gestured vaguely toward the wreckage they were leaving behind. As they navigated the treacherous terrain, Frank's mind processed the situation. A military aircraft with ambiguous markings, a pilot carrying something sufficiently valuable to warrant immediate pursuit during a severe storm. The implication of internal security breaches, whatever he had stumbled into, extended far beyond a simple crash rescue. "I have a satellite phone," Frank mentioned, negotiating a particularly steep incline. "Military grade, kept it from my service. Days maintain the subscription for emergencies." "Perfect," Reed replied, a hint of relief in her voice. "I'll need it once we're secure. I have authentication codes that can get us direct lines to the right people." She studied Frank's profile in the dim light. "You're taking this remarkably well, Mr. Carson." Frank offered a slight shrug as he guided the vehicle between two massive oaks. "Not my first extraction under fire, Commander, though it has been a few decades." The farmhouse came into view through the driving rain, its solid presence a welcome sight. "Besides, seems to me if someone's willing to fly a helicopter, in weather like this to find you, whatever you're carrying must be mighty important." "More than you know," Reed confirmed grimly. They reached the barn without incident, though Frank noted with concern that the helicopter's search pattern had shifted in their direction. They had minutes at most before it would be directly overhead. Helping Reed from the gator, he supported her weight as they made their way through the connecting door that led from the barn directly into the mudroom of the main house. Pepper greeted them with alert curiosity, her usual enthusiastic welcome subdued by the stranger's presence and the tension she sensed. "Good girl," Frank soothed, directing her to stay clear as he helped Reed to the kitchen chair. "The cellar. Entrance is in the pantry," he explained, gathering additional medical supplies and the satellite phone. "It's well stocked. My late wife insisted we maintain supplies for at least 2 weeks in case of emergencies." Reed's eyes tracked to the window, where the faint glow of the helicopter's spotlight was now visible through the curtain of rain. "They're getting closer. Is there anything in your house that would tip them off? Family photos in military uniform? Service medals displayed?" Frank understood immediately. Nothing visible, all stored in the attic. He paused, considering. Should I make it look like no one's home? Reed shook her head carefully. No time, and they'll check regardless. But if you have any hunting rifles or firearms, we should take those with us. Don't want to leave them weapons. Frank nodded, impressed by her tactical thinking despite her injuries. He moved efficiently, gathering his shotgun and hunting rifle from the locked cabinet in his office, along with the handgun he kept in the bedside table, a 9mm Beretta, his service weapon that he'd been allowed to keep upon honorable discharge. The sound of the helicopter grew louder, nearly overhead now. Frank hurried back to the kitchen where Reed was attempting to stand, the black case clutched against her chest despite her injuries. Cellar now, Frank directed, supporting her weight while managing the firearms and medical kit. Pepper followed, closely, sensing the urgency as they moved into the pantry. The cellar entrance was concealed beneath an antique rug, a heavy wooden door with a recessed iron handle that Frank pulled open with practiced ease. The beam of a powerful spotlight swept across the kitchen windows as they descended the stairs, Frank kicking the door closed above them. The cellar was cool and dry, constructed decades ago as both storm shelter and fallout bunker, his grandfather's response to the Cold War tensions of the 1950s. Reinforced concrete walls, ventilation system with manual override, shelves stocked with supplies, a chemical toilet behind a privacy screen, even a small generator that powered the lights and a basic communication system. Frank helped Reed onto the cot against the far wall, placing the black case beside her before returning to secure the cellar door. Above them, the helicopter's engine noise reached its peak as it hovered directly overhead, the vibrations causing dust to drift down from the ceiling joints. They'll land as soon as they find a clear spot, Reed predicted, her voice tight with pain, as Frank began properly treating her injuries. Probably by your barn. How many entrances to the house? Front door, back door, cellar bulkhead around the side, Frank recited, cleaning the gash on her forehead with antiseptic. Bulkhead's padlocked from the outside and hasn't been opened in years, covered with ivy growth, too. Reed nodded slightly, wincing as Frank began examining her broken arm. Good. They'll do a standard search pattern, systematic coverage of all rooms, outbuildings, then expanding to the property perimeter. Without thermal imaging showing our exact position, they'll have to be thorough. Frank worked steadily, applying a pressure bandage to the leg wound before fashioning a proper splint for her arm. Who exactly are we hiding from, Commander? Might help to know what we're up against. Reed studied him briefly, clearly calculating how much to reveal. People who believe they're serving national interests, but are actually being manipulated by foreign assets, she finally replied. Former military and intelligence personnel who've been convinced they're part of a sanctioned operation. Her free hand rested protectively on the case. What I'm carrying would prove otherwise and identify the actual architects of the breach. A heavy thud from above interrupted their conversation, the unmistakable sound of the farmhouse's back door being forced open. Pepper growled softly, her ears alert, but a gentle hand from Frank silenced her. Satellite phone, Reed whispered urgently. I need to make contact while we still have time. Frank handed her the device, a ruggedized unit with encryption capabilities beyond standard civilian models. Reed activated it one-handed, her movements practiced despite her injuries, and entered a lengthy code sequence from memory. The connection process was silent, the unit designed for covert operations. Authentication, Whiskey Echo 957, Lieutenant Commander Reed. She spoke softly into the device. Broken Arrow confirmed, package secure but compromised. Request immediate. QRF, authentication required. She paused, listening to the response only she could hear. Affirmative, civilian assistance, former Air Force SNR specialist, location transmitting now. Another pause. Understood. Read out. She lowered the phone, her expression marginally relieved. Help is coming, but not until the storm clears. Enough for air transport. Current estimate is 3 hours minimum. We need to hold position and keep this case secure until then. Above them, the systematic sounds of the search continued. Furniture being moved, doors opened, the methodical progression of professionals conducting a thorough sweep. Frank estimated at least 4 individuals based on the distribution of footsteps. They'll find this cellar eventually, he observed quietly, completing the splint on Reed's arm. It's not on any property records. I've maintained it privately. No, but a thorough search will reveal it. Reed nodded grimly. My team is aware of the situation. They're mobilizing with full tactical response, but this storm is hampering everyone. Our advantage is that the hostiles believe I died in the crash. They're searching for the case, not a survivor. So we wait, Frank concluded, securing the last bandage and administering painkillers from his kit. We wait, Reed confirmed, and we prepare for the possibility they find us before my team arrives. Frank checked his weapons, positioning them strategically around the cellar, then dimmed the lights to the minimum necessary for visibility. Pepper settled at his feet, her body tense but disciplined, sensing the gravity of their situation. A heavy thud from directly overhead made them both freeze. Someone had moved into the pantry, footsteps slow and deliberate. Frank exchanged a glance with Reed, who tightened her grip on the case. The iron handle of the cellar door rattled slightly as someone tested it. "Got a locked door here," a voice called, muffled but audible through the wooden barrier. "Could be a basement or storm shelter." "Mark it," another voice responded, carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to giving orders. "We'll come back if the primary sweep doesn't produce results." The footsteps retreated, and Frank released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The search team was being methodical, marking potential hiding places, but not yet committing to a thorough investigation of each one. It bought them time, but also confirmed Frank's assessment. These were professionals conducting a coordinated operation. "They're leaving markers," Reed whispered. "Standard procedure for systematic property search. They'll complete an initial sweep of all buildings, then return to investigate any potential hiding spots they've marked." Frank nodded, already calculating. "That gives us maybe 20 minutes before they return. Less if they don't find anything promising elsewhere." "We need options," Reed said, her tactical mind clearly working despite her injuries. "Alternatives if they breach this location before extraction arrives." Frank considered their position. The cellar was defensible, but ultimately a dead end. If the search team decided to force entry, they'd eventually succeed, and the resulting confrontation would put both Reed and the crucial intelligence she carried at risk. "There might be another way," Frank said finally, moving to what appeared to be a solid concrete wall at the far end of the cellar. "My father was paranoid about being trapped during the Cold War. Built this place with an emergency exit." Reed watched with interest as Frank pressed against a specific section of the wall. A previously invisible seam appeared, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough for a person to navigate. "It leads to the old well house, about 70 yards from here. From there, we could potentially reach the drainage culvert that runs beneath my eastern field." "The storm would provide cover," Reed observed, studying the passage with a professional eye, "but my mobility is limited, and we'd be exposed if they expand their search perimeter." Frank weighed their options carefully. "I could create a diversion, draw their attention away from this area long enough for you to reach the conservation land beyond my property. My neighbor's hunting cabin is about a half-mile into those woods. Basic but defensible, and it has communication equipment." Reed shook her head firmly. "The case is priority, but I won't risk civilian casualties. These people won't hesitate to eliminate witnesses." Her eyes met Frank's with unwavering determination. "If we move together." Before Frank could respond, The satellite phone vibrated with an incoming transmission. Reed activated it, listening intently to information only she could hear. "Understood," she responded after a moment. "Confirm approach from southern quadrant, utilizing natural depression for concealment. Authentication protocols will be observed." She ended the call, turning to Frank with renewed focus. "Situation has changed. My team has identified a weather window approaching from the south. They're accelerating the extraction timeline. New ETA 45 minutes. Frank processed this information quickly. "The southern approach crosses Phillips Creek. It's running high after this rain. They'll need to find a crossing point." "They're aware of the terrain challenges," Reed confirmed, "but this is our best opportunity. The storm cell is breaking up faster than predicted, which means visibility will improve shortly. Once that happens, these operatives will have much greater search capability." A new sound interrupted their planning, the heavy thud of footsteps returning to the pantry overhead far sooner than expected. The iron handle rattled more insistently this time. "Doors secure," the same voice reported. "Likely barred from inside." "Use the breaching kit," the commander ordered. "If there's something worth hiding behind a barred door, we need to see it." Frank and Reed exchanged alarmed glances. Their timeline had just collapsed from 20 minutes to perhaps 2. "Tunnel, now," Frank directed, already helping Reed to her feet. Pepper rose with them, alert to the urgency in her master's voice. "I'll seal it behind us." The passage was narrow and roughly hewn, clearly designed for emergency use rather than comfort. Reed moved with remarkable determination despite her injuries, the case secured to her side with a makeshift sling Frank had created from a medical bandage. The sound of drilling came from behind them as the search team began working on the cellar door. Frank estimated they had perhaps 90 seconds before they breached the entrance. "Keep going," he urged Reed, who was navigating the cramped tunnel, with one arm essentially useless. "I'll be right behind you." When Reed had progressed about 10 yards into the passage, Frank returned to the cellar entrance. He quickly gathered essential supplies: the satellite phone, extra ammunition, water and medical supplies, then retreated into the tunnel. At the entrance, he activated a simple mechanism his father had installed decades ago. A support beam shifted position, causing a section of earth ceiling near the tunnel entrance to collapse, effectively sealing the passage behind them. The tunnel remained intact beyond the collapse point, but anyone breaching the cellar would find no evidence of the hidden exit, just an ordinary storm shelter with no occupants. The falling earth had been carefully engineered to look like natural deterioration rather than an intentional mechanism. Frank rejoined Reed, who had continued, making steady progress despite the difficult conditions. "Bought us some time," he explained quietly. "They'll search the cellar, find nothing, then expand their perimeter. We need to reach the well house before they begin wider sweeps." The passage extended for approximately 70 yards, maintaining a relatively straight path, except for one 45-degree turn that aligned it with the well house destination. The air was stale but breathable, the dirt walls reinforced with wooden supports that had held up surprisingly well over the decades. Frank led the way, using a small penlight to illuminate the most treacherous sections. Behind him, Reed moved. With determined silence, her breathing controlled, despite what must have been considerable pain from her injuries. Pepper padded quietly between them, the border collie's instincts keeping her close to both humans during this unfamiliar journey. "Your father was thorough," Reed observed softly as they navigated a particularly narrow section. "This type of preparation goes beyond standard civilian precautions." Frank nodded, though she likely couldn't see the gesture in the dim light. Korean War veteran, came back with a healthy respect for having escape routes, said he'd never be trapped anywhere again after what he experienced at Chosin Reservoir. Reed's expression changed subtly, recognition and respect evident even in the shadows. "The chosen few. My grandfather was there. 17 days at 20 below zero, surrounded by Chinese forces. This piece of shared history created an unexpected connection between them, transcending their current circumstances. Frank felt a deeper understanding of Reed's composure despite her injuries. She came from resilient stock. The distant sound of the cellar door being breached echoed faintly through the tunnel, followed by muffled voices expressing confusion and frustration. Frank estimated they had perhaps 10 minutes before the search team realized there must be another exit and began expanding their search parameters. They reached the well house access point, a vertical shaft with crude handholds carved into the dirt walls, leading up to a trapdoor concealed beneath the well house flooring. Frank climbed first, testing each handhold carefully before putting his full weight on it. The decades since its construction had weathered some of the supports, but the core structure remained sound. At the top, Frank eased the trapdoor open, a fraction peering into the well house interior. The small wooden structure was undisturbed, early evening light filtering through gaps in the weathered boards. No signs of the search team in the immediate vicinity. Frank opened the trapdoor fully, pulling himself up into the well house before reaching back to help Reed navigate the difficult vertical climb with her injuries. Pepper followed with the natural agility of her breed, requiring no assistance. To make the ascent, the well house offered momentary shelter, but Frank knew it would be among the first outbuildings checked when the search team expanded their perimeter. They needed to move quickly toward the property's eastern boundary, where Reed's extraction team would approach. "I need to check our route," Frank whispered, moving to a gap in the boards that offered a view of the farmyard. The scene outside had changed significantly during their time underground. The storm had largely passed, leaving a damp landscape bathed in the amber light of early evening. More concerning was the increased activity around the farmhouse. All 4 members of the search team now visible as they coordinated what appeared to be an expanded search pattern. 2 team members were heading toward the equipment barn, while the others appeared to be establishing a communication point near their helicopter. Their movements suggested growing frustration. They had expected to find the case quickly and were now recalibrating for a more thorough search operation. Frank assessed their options with the practiced eye of someone who had conducted search and rescue operations in hostile conditions. The direct route to the eastern property line would take them across open ground, completely exposed once they left the well house. The alternative was a longer path following a drainage ditch that offered concealment, but would significantly slow their progress, especially with Reed's injuries. "How's the arm?" Frank asked, turning back to Reed, who had settled against the wall to check the satellite phone. "Functional," she replied pragmatically, the military assessment replacing any personal discomfort. "The splint is holding. What's our situation?" "They're expanding the search pattern, starting with the main outbuildings. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they reach this position." Frank indicated the direction they needed to travel. "Eastern. Boundary is approximately 400 yards from here. Drainage ditch offers cover for about half that distance, then we're exposed crossing the upper field." Reed processed this information quickly, her training evident in how she prioritized tactical considerations over physical limitations. "Updates from my team confirm they're approaching from the southeast, ETA approximately 30 minutes. We need to reach the extraction point and secure it before they arrive." Frank nodded, already formulating a plan. "There's a secondary equipment shed near where the drainage ditch ends. If we can reach it undetected, it offers both cover and potential resources. I keep emergency supplies there, including communication equipment." "Lead on," Reed said simply, securing the satellite phone and adjusting her grip on the case. Frank eased open the well house door, facing away from the farmyard, checking for any sign of the search team before signaling Reed to follow. They emerged into the damp evening air, immediately moving in a crouched position toward the drainage ditch 30 yards away. The recent storm had filled it partially with water, but the sides remained passable if slippery. They reached the ditch, without incident, using its depth for concealment as they progressed eastward. The mud made movement difficult, particularly for Reed with her injuries, but they maintained a steady pace. Frank led the way, occasionally pausing to verify their route remained clear of search team members. About halfway to the equipment shed, Frank froze, raising his hand in a silent signal to stop. Voices carried from nearby. The search team had reached the well house sooner than expected. Through a gap in the vegetation along the ditch, he could see two team members methodically, examining the small structure, their movements professional and thorough. Footprints, one called to the other, kneeling to examine the muddy ground outside the well house door. Recent, 2 sets, plus what looks like a dog, heading east. Frank exchanged a glance with Reed, both recognizing their timeline had just collapsed dramatically. The search team would follow their trail to the drainage ditch within minutes. "We need a diversion," Reed whispered, her tactical mind already calculating options. "Something to draw them away from this vector." Frank considered possibilities. Quickly, his gaze settling on the irrigation controls near the northern field. A plan formed, drawing on his intimate knowledge of the farm's systems. "Stay here," he directed Reed, handing her his handgun. "I'll create a diversion that should buy us 15 minutes. When you hear it start, continue along this ditch to the equipment shed. I'll meet you there." Before Reed could protest, Frank moved with surprising agility for his age, using the drainage ditch for cover as he progressed toward the irrigation controls. His decades of navigating this property in all conditions served him well now, allowing him to move both quickly and silently despite the challenging terrain. Reaching the control panel without being detected, Frank utilized his knowledge of the system to create the diversion they needed. The irrigation equipment had been upgraded over the years, but he'd maintained the original manual override capabilities, a precaution born of his father's influence and his own experience with technology failures. Frank bypassed the electronic controls, engaging the manual systems for the northern field. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Dozens of irrigation sprinklers activated simultaneously, creating an enormous disturbance visible from anywhere on the property. Water sprayed in high arcs across the field, the unexpected activation drawing immediate attention from the search team. "Movement! North field!" one of the team members called, already changing direction toward the commotion. His partner followed, both clearly believing they had located their quarry, attempting to use the irrigation system as cover for escape. Frank remained hidden near the controls long enough to confirm both search team members were fully committed to investigating the northern field. Once certain their attention was diverted, he circled back toward the drainage ditch, rejoining Reed, who had made significant progress toward the equipment shed. "Effective diversion," she commented as he fell into step beside her. "How long will it hold them?" "Long enough," Frank replied, helping her navigate a particularly steep section of the ditch. "They'll eventually realize it's automated, but not before thoroughly searching that area. The other team members will join them. Standard protocol when a potential contact is identified." They reached the equipment shed without further incident, finding it undisturbed as Frank had anticipated. The small structure housed various farm implements and seasonal equipment, but more importantly, contained the emergency supplies Frank had mentioned. Inside, Frank immediately accessed a hidden compartment beneath a workbench, revealing a cache that would have impressed most military operators. Emergency rations, medical supplies, ammunition, and communications equipment that appeared more sophisticated than standard civilian gear. "You're well prepared for emergencies," Reed observed, a note of professional appreciation in her voice as she surveyed the cache. "Old habits," Frank replied, activating a specialized radio system. "This connects to emergency services through alternative frequencies." should allow us to communicate with your extraction team more securely than the satellite phone. Reed provided the necessary authentication codes, establishing contact with her approaching team. The response confirmed they were approximately 20 minutes from the extraction point, a small clearing near the eastern property boundary that offered sufficient space for a helicopter landing while maintaining tree cover for security. "We need to move soon," Frank noted, checking the perimeter through a small window. "They'll realize the irrigation diversion was automated within 10 minutes, then resume the search pattern. We're still 400 yards from the extraction point across increasingly open terrain." Reed nodded, accepting additional medical supplies and water from Frank's cache. "If we wait until dusk, we'll have better concealment. The light is already fading." Frank considered this approach. Dusk was indeed approaching, the lengthening shadows offering increasingly effective concealment. However, it also meant the search team would likely employ thermal imaging equipment, negating much of that advantage. "They'll have night vision capabilities," he noted, voicing this concern, "and thermal imaging that would make us stand out clearly once the ambient temperature drops." Reed acknowledged this reality with a grim nod. "We need to reach the extraction point before full darkness then. Their equipment gives them the advantage after sunset." Frank formulated a plan, drawing on his knowledge of both the property and tactical operations. "There's a line of drainage tiles that runs from near this position to within 50 yards of the extraction point. The access points are wide enough to move through, and they won't register clearly on thermal imaging due to the ground temperature differential." Reed raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "A sewer system on a farm?" "Not sewers," Frank clarified. "Agricultural drainage system. Keeps the fields from flooding during heavy rains. My grandfather installed them in the 1940s, upgraded them. Myself in the 90s. They're concrete tiles, 36 inches in diameter, tight but navigable." Reed considered this option, weighing it against her injuries and the alternative of crossing open ground. "Access points? Maintenance hatch 20 yards from here, behind the equipment shed. Emerges near the tree line at the eastern boundary." The decision crystallized for both of them simultaneously. The drainage system offered their best chance of reaching the extraction point undetected. The discomfort and difficulty of navigating the confined space was far preferable to the risk of being spotted crossing open terrain. Frank gathered essential supplies from the cache, including additional first aid materials, light sources, and communications equipment. They waited until the search team had fully committed to investigating the irrigation diversion before making their move to the drainage system access point. The maintenance hatch was concealed beneath a small concrete pad that appeared to be a simple equipment foundation. Frank removed the camouflaged cover, revealing a ladder descending into the main drainage line. "I'll go first," he offered, already positioning himself to descend. The main line runs straight east for about 300 yards, then branches. We'll take the southeast fork to reach the extraction point. The interior of the drainage system was exactly as Frank had described, a concrete tube large enough to move through in a crouched position, though not comfortably. The recent storm had left several inches of water flowing along the bottom, but the passage remained navigable. Reed followed Frank into the system, her determination evident in how she managed the descent despite her injuries. The case remained secured to her body, its contents still mysterious to Frank, despite everything they'd done to protect it. They made steady progress through the drainage system, moving in a hunched position that was uncomfortable but effective. Frank led the way, occasionally checking their route against his mental map of the system. Above them, they could periodically hear the faint sounds of the search team as they passed overhead, still unaware of their quarry's underground passage. "Your familiarity with this property is impressive," Reed observed during a brief rest. "Most people wouldn't know their land in this level of detail." Frank offered a modest shrug. When you've worked the same soil for 40 years, you get to know every inch of it. Had to map the entire drainage system when we upgraded it, committed it to memory. That kind of knowledge is invaluable in situations like this, Reed replied, her professional assessment transcending their circumstantial partnership. In my line of work, we spend months studying terrain before operations. You've had decades. They continued through the drainage system, making the turn at the southeast, as Frank had outlined. The extraction point was now approximately 100 yards ahead, beyond the final access hatch that would bring them to the surface near the eastern property line. Frank paused at a junction to check their position and timing. According to the communication with Reed's team, the extraction helicopter would approach in approximately 10 minutes. They needed to reach the surface and secure the landing zone before its arrival. Almost there, he encouraged Reed, noting her increasing fatigue despite her disciplined composure. Her injuries and the physical demands of their escape were taking in their toll, though she hadn't uttered a single complaint. As they approached the final access point, Frank slowed their pace, proceeding with additional caution. The exit point would be their most vulnerable moment. Emerging from concealment into potentially exposed terrain, he needed to verify the area was clear before they surfaced. The access hatch was located in a shallow depression near the edge of the eastern field, partially concealed by natural vegetation. Frank climbed the maintenance ladder cautiously, easing the cover open just enough to conduct a visual sweep of the surrounding area. The scene appeared clear, no immediate signs of the search team, who were still focused on other areas of the property. Based on the distant voices Frank could hear, the extraction point lay 50 yards beyond their position, a small clearing in the tree line that would provide sufficient space for a helicopter landing while maintaining natural cover. Frank secured the area before signaling Reed to join him. On the surface, as she emerged from the drainage system, he noted her heightened alertness despite her physical exhaustion. The case remained secured to her side, her good hand never straying far from it. Extraction point is just beyond those trees, Frank indicated, pointing toward the small clearing. Your team confirmed 5 minutes until arrival. They moved carefully across the final stretch of open ground, utilizing the natural depressions and vegetation for concealment. The evening light had faded significantly, creating both advantages and challenges. Reduced visibility to potential observers, but increased likelihood the search team would deploy their advanced imaging equipment. Reaching the tree line, Frank guided them along a natural path toward the clearing, his knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable once again. The extraction point appeared exactly as anticipated, a small natural opening in the forest, approximately 30 yards in diameter with sufficient clearance for a helicopter approach. Reed established final communication with her extraction team, confirming their position and receiving updated arrival information. Frank secured the perimeter, identifying potential threat vectors and establishing defensive positions if they became necessary. The distant sound of rotor blades became audible, growing steadily louder as the extraction helicopter approached. Almost simultaneously, they heard voices from the direction of the farm. The search team had finally expanded their perimeter to include the eastern boundary. "They're coming," Frank observed, his voice calm despite the implications. "We need to hold this position for 3 minutes until your team arrives." Reed nodded grimly, removing the handgun from her belt despite her injured arm. Her expression conveyed what both understood. If the search team reached their position before the extraction helicopter arrived, they would have no choice but to defend themselves. Frank positioned himself at the edge of the clearing with a clear view of the likely approach vector for the search team. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the distinctive sound of professional operators moving through unfamiliar terrain, careful but purposeful. Through gaps in the vegetation, Frank caught glimpses of two team members approaching their position, moving in a standard search pattern. Their equipment was now clearly visible: tactical gear, night vision equipment, and military-grade weapons. They would reach the clearing within 2 minutes, just before the extraction helicopter arrived. "We need a diversion," Reed whispered, recognizing the same tactical reality Frank had assessed. Frank considered their limited options, his gaze settling on a decaying tree trunk approximately 20 yards from their position, in the opposite direction from the approaching search team. With careful calculation, he retrieved his last emergency, flare from his supplies. "When I activate this, move to the northeast corner of the clearing," he directed Reed. "The extraction team will approach from that direction. I'll draw their attention away long enough for your helicopter to land." Before Reed could protest, Frank moved with practiced stealth toward the position he'd identified. The search team was now close enough that he could hear their communications. Terse, professional exchanges as they coordinated their approach to the eastern boundary. With precise timing, Frank activated the flare and tossed it beyond the decaying tree trunk, creating an immediate and dramatic distraction as it ignited with brilliant red illumination. The effect was exactly as intended. Both search team members immediately diverted toward the unexpected light source, their training creating a predictable response to a potential target indicator. Frank used their momentary distraction to circle back toward Reed, who had moved to the northeast corner of the clearing as directed. The sound of the approaching helicopter was now unmistakable, seconds away from arriving at their position. The extraction helicopter appeared over the tree line, a sleek military model without visible markings. It descended toward the clearing with practiced precision, hovering momentarily before settling into a landing position. The side door slid open, revealing a tactical team in full gear, providing immediate security as Reed moved toward the aircraft. Frank maintained his position at the perimeter, ensuring the search team remained distracted by the flare long enough for Reed to reach the helicopter safely. The tactical team from the aircraft had established a defensive perimeter, their weapons trained on the surrounding forest with professional discipline. "Mr. Carson!" Reed called from the helicopter doorway, gesturing urgently for him to join. "Let's go!" Frank hesitated, glancing back toward his farm, visible in the distance. This was his home, his land, everything he had worked for across decades. The thought of abandoning it, even temporarily, created a moment of internal conflict that transcended the immediate tactical situation. A burst of gunfire from the direction of the search team shattered his hesitation. They had realized the flare was a diversion and were now advancing toward the clearing, having spotted the helicopter. The extraction team responded with covering fire, creating a corridor for Frank to reach the aircraft. Frank sprinted across the clearing, decades of farm work having kept him in better condition than most men his age. He reached the helicopter as the tactical team laid down a final suppressive volley, discouraging further pursuit from the search team. The aircraft lifted off immediately, banking sharply as it gained altitude and accelerated away from the property. Through the window, Frank watched his farm recede into the distance. The buildings and fields that had defined his existence for decades now appearing small and vulnerable from this new perspective. Reed sat across from him, the case finally released from its secure position against her body and now properly locked to a specialized bracket within the aircraft. Medical personnel were attending to her injuries with professional efficiency, though her attention remained focused on Frank. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying genuine gratitude that transcended professional courtesy. "What you did today mattered more than you know." Frank nodded in acknowledgement, his thoughts still processing the extraordinary sequence of events that had transformed an ordinary day on his farm into something that apparently held national security implications. "Where are we going?" he asked, the question both practical and existential as the helicopter continued its rapid journey away from the only home he had known for decades. Secure medical facility first, the team leader responded, overhearing the question. Commander Reed requires proper treatment for her injuries, then a debriefing at a classified location. The man studied Frank with professional assessment. Your actions today potentially saved lives far beyond just those present, Mr. Carson. What the commander is carrying impacts national security at the highest levels. Frank absorbed this information silently, his farmer's pragmatism already calculating more immediate concerns. My dog, he began. Pepper is being retrieved by a secondary team, the leader assured him. Along with any personal effects you'll need during the debriefing period. We're not in the business of leaving loyal canines behind, sir. This unexpected consideration for such a personal concern surprised Frank, humanizing what had otherwise been an operation conducted with military precision and focus. His expression must have revealed this surprise because the team leader offered a rare smile. Standard protocol for civilian assistance, he explained, especially when that assistance proves as valuable as yours has today. The medical treatment for Reed continued throughout the flight, the team working with practiced efficiency to stabilize her injuries and prepare her for more comprehensive care upon arrival. Frank watched with quiet respect, impressed by both Reed's stoicism and the team's professionalism. The case, Frank finally asked, his curiosity overcoming his usual reserve. What exactly am I helping protect? Reed exchanged a glance with the team leader, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Authorization to provide limited information given Frank's involvement. Evidence of compromised nuclear defense systems, Reed explained, her voice low despite the privacy of their current situation. Names, dates, access protocols, proof that certain individuals within our government have been selling classified information to foreign interests. Her expression hardened slightly, information that could fundamentally alter the balance of power if it fell into the wrong hands. Frank processed this soberly, the weight of the situation finally settling fully on his shoulders. What had begun as a simple act of helping an injured pilot during a storm had evolved into something with implications that reached far beyond his Iowa farm. Why were you flying in those conditions? He asked, pieces of the puzzle still missing from his understanding. The storm provided cover, Reed explained. Reduced radar effectiveness, disrupted standard monitoring patterns. We believed it would allow us to transport the evidence securely to Washington. A shadow crossed her face. Obviously, the compromise extends further than we anticipated. They knew about the flight, despite our precautions. The helicopter began its descent toward what appeared to be a military installation, though Frank could see no identifying markings from his vantage point. Security protocols were already visible in the coordinated movement of ground personnel preparing for their arrival. What happens now? Frank asked, watching the approaching landing zone with mixed emotions, concern for what lay ahead balanced against relief that Reed would receive proper medical care. For Commander Reed, immediate medical treatment, followed by secure transport. To Washington with the evidence, the team leader explained. For you, Mr. Carson, a comprehensive debriefing, then arrangements for your return home once security protocols permit. Frank nodded, accepting this explanation with the practical mindset that had guided him through decades of farming, addressing each challenge as it presented itself rather than becoming overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. The helicopter touched down with practiced precision, immediately surrounded by a security team that established a protective cordon. Medical personnel approached with a stretcher for Reed, though she insisted on walking with assistance, maintaining custody of the case until the formal transfer protocol could be completed. Frank followed, escorted by two team members who maintained a respectful but vigilant presence. The facility appeared to be a hybrid military and intelligence operation, with both uniformed personnel and individuals in civilian attire moving with purposeful efficiency. They were led to a secure area where Reed was transferred to the medical unit, the case formally signed over to authorized personnel through a rigidly documented chain of custody. Before being taken for treatment, Reed paused to face Frank directly. "What you did today will never appear in any public record, Mr. Carson," she said, her professional demeanor softening briefly. "But I want you to know that you've served your country as significantly today as any soldier on any battlefield. Thank you." With that, she was escorted away, the case containing the vital intelligence now securely in the custody of the proper authorities. Frank found himself guided to a different section of the facility, where a comfortable but clearly secure room had been prepared for him. "The debriefing will begin in approximately 1 hour," his escort informed him. "In the meantime, please, make yourself comfortable. There are refreshments available, and if you require anything specific, please inform the security team." Left alone for the first time since the extraordinary sequence of events had begun, Frank took a moment to fully process what had transpired. In less than 12 hours, he had gone from preparing for a routine thunderstorm to participating in a classified intelligence operation that apparently had implications for national security at the highest levels. The room, while comfortable, was clearly designed for security rather than hospitality. No windows, a single door with electronic access controls, and subtle but unmistakable monitoring systems integrated into the infrastructure. It was a stark contrast to the open spaces and natural rhythms of his farm life. Frank had just settled into one of the chairs when the door opened, revealing a tall, distinguished man in civilian clothes whose bearing immediately identified him as military, despite the absence of uniform. "Mr. Carson," the man greeted him, extending a hand. "I'm General James Harwood, Director of Special Operations Command. I wanted to personally thank you for your assistance today before the formal debriefing begins." Frank rose to shake the offered hand, somewhat surprised by the presence of such a high-ranking officer. "Just did what needed doing, sir." The general smiled slightly at this understated response. "That's precisely what makes your contribution so valuable, Mr. Carson. Doing what needs doing without hesitation when the stakes are highest." He gestured for Frank to sit again. "Commander Reed has already provided her initial report. Your actions today potentially prevented a catastrophic intelligence breach." Frank accepted this assessment with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his response throughout the day's events. "How is the commander doing?" "Stable and receiving excellent care," the general assured him. "Her injuries, while significant, are not life-threatening. The medical team expects a full recovery." He paused, studying Frank with evident respect. "She also mentioned your impressive tactical thinking and terrain knowledge, said you navigated your property with the skill of a special operations veteran." Frank shrugged slightly, uncomfortable with praise that seemed disproportionate to what he viewed as simple necessity. Spent 40 years working that land. Would be embarrassing not to know it well. The general smiled again at this modest response. "Well, regardless of how you characterize it, your actions today have significant implications." He leaned forward, slightly, his expression becoming more serious, "which brings me to a matter of some delicacy. The President has been briefed on today's events and has expressed a desire to thank you personally." Frank blinked in surprise. "The President of the United States?" "Indeed," the general confirmed. "Given the classified nature of the operation, such recognition would need to occur under secure conditions. The President's advance team has already begun evaluating your property for a potential visit, assuming you're comfortable with that arrangement." The concept seemed utterly disconnected from Frank's normal reality. Presidential visits were things that happened in cities or at major events, not on modest farms in rural Iowa. Yet the general's matter-of-fact tone suggested this was being treated as a straightforward logistical matter rather than the extraordinary circumstance it represented from Frank's perspective. "My farm?" Frank asked, still processing the implications. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, assuming security protocols can be established in time," the general replied. "We can have you back home tonight after the debriefing is complete. A security detail would remain on your property overnight, with the presidential motorcade arriving approximately 0900 hours. Frank absorbed this information with the pragmatic acceptance that had characterized his response to the day's extraordinary events. If the President of the United States wanted to visit his farm, who was he to question the protocols or timing? "I suppose that would be all right," he responded, understating what was clearly a momentous development, "though I'm not sure what the neighbors will make of it." The general chuckled, apparently appreciating Frank's practical perspective amid such unusual circumstances. "Security protocols will include a discreet perimeter. As far as your neighbors will be concerned, it will appear to be a routine agricultural inspection or similar official visit. The presidential motorcade will approach via your northern access road, minimizing visibility from surrounding properties." Dusu, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the debriefing team. 3 professionals whose roles weren't specified, but whose demeanor suggested intelligence backgrounds rather than standard military. The general rose, extending his hand again. "Thank you again for your service today, Mr. Carson. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow during the presidential visit." With that, he departed, leaving Frank with the debriefing team and the remarkable prospect of hosting the commander-in-chief on his modest Iowa farm the following morning. The debriefing itself was thorough but respectful, conducted with a professionalism that acknowledged Frank's civilian status while recognizing the significance of his role in the day's events. He recounted each step of the extraordinary sequence in detail, finding Reed at the crash site, treating her injuries, evading the search team, and ultimately reaching the extraction point. Throughout the process, Frank maintained the straightforward, factual approach that had characterized his life, reporting what had happened without embellishment or unnecessary commentary. The team occasionally asked clarifying questions, but largely allowed him to tell the story in his own way. When the debriefing concluded some 2 hours later, Frank was provided with a secure transport back to his property. The journey occurred in near darkness, the vehicle moving with practiced efficiency through the night landscape. As they approached his farm, Frank could see subtle but unmistakable signs of the security presence already established. Vehicles positioned strategically, personnel maintaining a perimeter, communications equipment being installed. What struck him most, however, was how quickly his perspective had shifted. Just that morning, the farm had been simply home, the place he had lived and worked for decades. Now, viewing it through the lens of the day's events, he recognized the tactical advantages and vulnerabilities in a way he had never consciously considered before. The security team escorted him to his house, which had been thoroughly inspected and secured during his absence. To his considerable relief, Pepper greeted him enthusiastically at the door, apparently unfazed by the day's disruptions and the unfamiliar personnel now occupying the property. "Your dog has been fed and exercised, sir," one of the security team informed him with professional courtesy. "And we've taken the liberty of addressing the damage to your cellar entrance. Our engineering team has restored it to full functionality." Frank thanked them, somewhat bemused by this intersection of high-level security protocols with the practical details of farm life. He was provided with a communication device and instructions for contacting the security team if needed, then left to settle in for the night. with the assurance that preparations for the presidential visit would continue without disrupting his personal space. Alone in his kitchen with Pepper at his feet, Frank finally had time to fully process the extraordinary sequence of events. What had begun as routine storm preparations had escalated into a classified operation, culminating in a pending presidential visit. The modest farmhouse that had been his home for decades would, within hours, host the Commander-in-Chief of the United States. As he prepared for bed that night, Frank Carson, farmer, widower, dog owner, and now improbably participant in a matter of national security, reflected on the remarkable truth that sometimes the most significant moments in life arise, not from grand plans or deliberate choices, but simply from deciding to help someone in need during a storm. The morning dawned clear and bright, the previous day's turbulent weather replaced by a pristine Iowa summer day. Frank rose early out of lifelong habit, moving through his morning routine despite the extraordinary circumstances. Through the kitchen window, he could see the security preparations had advanced significantly overnight. Communications equipment established, personnel positioned strategically, and what appeared to be an impromptu helipad constructed in his east field. At precisely 8:30, a security team representative arrived at the door to brief him on the approaching presidential visit. The protocols were explained with professional efficiency, where Frank should be positioned, the anticipated sequence of events, the security measures already in place. Throughout the explanation, Frank listened with the same attentive focus he applied to understanding weather patterns or crop yields, absorbing the information as another practical matter to be addressed methodically. At 8:55, the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters broke the morning stillness. 3 military aircraft appeared over the horizon, approaching in tight formation before separating as they neared the farm. The lead helicopter, Marine One, Frank now recognized, descended toward the improvised landing zone in the east field, while the others maintained position overhead. The choreography that followed demonstrated the precision planning that accompanied presidential movements. Security personnel established a protective cordon from the landing zone to the farmhouse. Communications specialists confirmed secure channels, and advanced team members conducted final verifications of the route and meeting area. Frank stood on his porch, Pepper at his side, watching this extraordinary ballet of security and protocol transform his modest farm into a temporary extension of presidential operations. Despite the inherent drama of the situation, he found himself remarkably calm. The same steady presence that had guided him through decades of farming, military service, and yesterday's unexpected adventure. Marine One touched down with practiced precision, its rotors continuing to turn as the side door opened. Security personnel moved into final positions as the President of the United States emerged from the aircraft, pausing briefly to acknowledge the team before proceeding along the secured pathway toward the farmhouse. Frank walked down the porch steps to meet his unprecedented visitor, extending his hand as the president approached. The handshake was firm and genuine, accompanied by a smile that conveyed sincere appreciation rather than political performance. "Mr. Carson," the president greeted him, "I've been looking forward to meeting you. What you did yesterday potentially prevented a serious compromise of our national security. I wanted to thank you personally." "Just did what needed doing, Mr. President," Frank replied, the same straightforward response he had given to the general the previous day. Anyone would have done the same. The president's expression suggested he knew better. "From what I've been told, anyone wouldn't have had the skills, knowledge, or courage to accomplish what you did. Commander Reed's report was quite specific about how essential your assistance was to the success of her mission." Frank accepted this assessment with characteristic modesty, inviting the president onto the porch where refreshments had been arranged by the advance team. As they settled into conversation, Frank was struck by how the extraordinary circumstances had transformed his humble farm into a nexus of national significance, if only temporarily. Their discussion ranged from the specifics of yesterday's events to broader reflections on service, duty, and the unexpected ways individuals can impact matters of significant consequence. Throughout, the president demonstrated genuine interest in Frank's perspectives, particularly his observations about how his military training had informed his response to the situation decades later. "You know," the president commented at one point, "there's something profoundly reassuring about knowing there are people like you across this country, Mr. Carson. People who don't hesitate when faced with doing the right thing, even at personal risk." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "It's the foundation everything else is built on." As their conversation concluded, the president indicated a small case one of his aides had brought forward. "We'd like to recognize your service officially, Mr. Carson. Given the classified nature of yesterday's events, it can't be acknowledged publicly, but this comes with the sincere gratitude of a nation that will never know precisely what you did, but is safer because you did it." Inside the case was a medal Frank recognized despite its rarity, one of the nation's highest civilian honors, awarded only in exceptional circumstances and almost never to private citizens. The accompanying certificate bore the presidential seal and Frank's name, with a citation intentionally vague enough to maintain security while acknowledging extraordinary service to the nation. "I can't accept," Frank began, but the president raised a hand, stopping him. "You can and you will," he said firmly but kindly. "Not for yourself, perhaps, but for what it represents, for the reminder that ordinary citizens doing extraordinary your things is what has always made this country great." He closed the box and pressed it into Frank's hand. "Keep it somewhere private if you wish, but accept it with the gratitude of a nation that is safer today because of your actions." Their meeting concluded shortly thereafter, the demands of the presidential schedule requiring departure after approximately 30 minutes. As Frank stood on his porch, watching Marine One lift off from his east field, the president visible in the window offering a final wave, he felt the weight of the past 24 hours settle into something permanent and significant. The security team began the efficient process of withdrawing, restoring his property to its normal state, with the same precision that had characterized their arrival. By midday, the only evidence of the extraordinary visit would be the slightly flattened grass where Marine One had landed and the medal box now resting on Frank's kitchen table. As normality gradually returned to the farm, Frank found himself reflecting on the remarkable sequence of events that had begun with a simple decision to help someone in need during a storm. That choice, instinctive rather than calculated, had set in motion circumstances that connected his modest Iowa farm to matters of national security and ultimately brought the President of the United States to his front porch. There was a profound lesson in that progression, Frank realized, as he went about restoring his regular farm routines. The most significant moments in life often arise not from grand ambitions or carefully constructed plans, but from the small, decisive choices we make when confronted with someone who needs help. Standing in his field that evening, watching the sunset paint the familiar landscape in shades of amber and gold, Frank Carson, farmer, veteran, and now, however unlikely, hero, understood that the true measure of a life well lived isn't found in the recognition it receives or the status it achieves, but in the fundamental willingness to help others when the opportunity presents itself. The medal would remain in its box, stored away with his military commendations and family mementos. The president's visit would become a private memory, undocumented in any public record. The farm would continue as it always had, the rhythms of planting and harvest marking the passage of time. But something essential had been affirmed in Frank's understanding of the world and his place in it. The recognition that sometimes the simple choice to stop and help someone during a storm is exactly where the most meaningful journeys begin. They navigated the drainage system in tense silence, the concrete pipes just wide enough for their hunched progress. Frank led, occasionally glancing back to check on Reed, who followed with remarkable determination despite her injuries. Yasin, case remained secured to her side, its contents still unknown to Frank, yet clearly worth the extraordinary measures to protect it. Coming up on the exit point, Frank whispered as they approached the final segment. Once we emerge, we'll have 50 yards of open terrain before reaching the extraction zone. Reed nodded, her professional composure intact despite hours of physical strain. My team confirms. Position near the eastern tree line, ETA 3 minutes. Frank climbed the access ladder first, carefully easing the hatch open to survey their surroundings. The evening had deepened toward dusk, lengthening shadows, providing some concealment as they emerged into a shallow depression near the edge of his eastern field. No immediate signs of the search team, though distant voices suggested they had expanded their perimeter after discovering the irrigation diversion was automated. Clear for now, Frank confirmed, helping Reed from the drainage system. Extraction point is just beyond that tree line. They moved swiftly across the exposed ground, using natural depressions for partial cover. Reed maintained pace despite her injuries, her military training evident in how she balanced speed with stealth. The case never left her side, its contents representing whatever national security matter had triggered this extraordinary sequence of events. Reaching the tree line, they followed a natural path toward the small clearing designated as the extraction point, Frank's intimate knowledge of his property proving invaluable once again. Through gaps in the vegetation, they could see the clearing, approximately 30 yards in diameter, with sufficient space for a helicopter landing while maintaining forest cover for security. The distinctive sound of approaching rotor blades grew steadily louder, coinciding with voices from behind them. The search team had finally expanded their perimeter to include the eastern boundary. "They're coming," Frank observed calmly. "We need to hold this position until your team arrives." Reed nodded grimly, drawing her handgun despite her injured arm. Frank positioned himself at the edge of the clearing, identifying the likely approach vector for the searchers. Through the vegetation, he glimpsed 2 team members moving in their direction, their tactical gear and weapons clearly visible in the fading light. "We need a diversion," Reed whispered urgently. Frank retrieved his last emergency flare, calculating trajectory and timing with precision born of military experience. "When I activate this, move to the northeast corner. The extraction team will approach from that direction." Before Reed could protest his placing himself at risk, Frank moved toward a position 20 yards away, opposite from the approaching search team. With precise timing, he activated the flare and tossed it beyond a decaying tree trunk. The brilliant red illumination immediately drew the searchers' attention, their training creating a predictable response to a potential target indicator. Using their momentary distraction, Frank circled back toward Reed, who had reached the northeast. "Corner as directed." The extraction helicopter appeared over the tree line, a sleek military model without markings, descending toward the clearing with practiced precision. The helicopter settled into a landing position as its side door slid open, revealing a tactical team in full gear. They established immediate security while Reed moved toward the aircraft, the case still secured to her side. "Mr. Carson," she called from the doorway, gesturing urgently. "Let's go." Frank hesitated, glancing back toward his farm in the distance. The thought of abandoning his home, even temporarily, created profound conflict. This land had defined his existence for decades, leaving it felt fundamentally wrong despite the circumstances. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, shattering his hesitation. The search team had spotted the helicopter and was advancing. The extraction team responded with covering fire, creating a corridor for Frank to reach the aircraft. He sprinted across the clearing as the tactical team provided suppression, reaching the helicopter moments before it lifted off. Through the window, Frank watched his farm recede into the distance, the buildings and fields that had been his entire world now diminishing to toy-like proportions. Reed sat across from him, the case finally secured to a specialized bracket within the aircraft. Medical personnel tended to her injuries as she maintained her focus on Frank. "Thank you," she said. Genuine gratitude transcending professional courtesy. "What you did today mattered more than you know." Frank nodded, still processing the extraordinary sequence of events that had transformed a routine storm day into a classified operation with apparent national security implications. "Where are we going?" he asked, as the helicopter continued its journey away from the only home he had known for decades. "Secure medical facility first," the team leader explained. "Commander Reed requires treatment, then debriefing at a classified location." He studied Frank with evident respect. "Your actions today potentially saved lives beyond just those present. What she's carrying impacts national security at the highest levels." Frank's first thought was practical rather than philosophical. "My dog is being retrieved by a secondary team," the leader assured him, "along with any personal items you'll need. We don't leave loyal canines behind." This consideration for such a personal concern surprised Frank, humanizing what had otherwise been an operation conducted with military precision. "Standard protocol for civilian assistance," the leader explained, noting Frank's surprise, "especially when that assistance proves as valuable as yours." Reed, despite ongoing medical treatment, maintained enough awareness to interject. "The President will want to thank you personally. That's standard protocol as well, for civilian assistance of this magnitude." "The President of the United States?" Frank questioned, the concept seemingly disconnected from his Iowa farm reality. "Given the classified nature of this operation, such recognition would occur at your property rather than a government facility," the team leader confirmed. "Presidential movement protocols can accommodate these situations." As the helicopter approached a military installation, Frank found himself contemplating the remarkable chain of events that had begun with his decision to help an injured pilot during a storm. What had started as a simple act of decency had escalated into something with implications apparently significant enough to warrant presidential attention. The debriefing proceeded with professional efficiency, Frank recounting the day's events in his characteristically straightforward manner. When completed, he was transported back to his farm, arriving after nightfall to find a security presence already established. Vehicles positioned strategically, personnel maintaining a perimeter, communications equipment being installed. To his considerable relief, Pepper greeted him enthusiastically at the door, apparently unfazed by the day's disruptions. "Your dog has been fed and exercised, sir," a security team member informed him. "And we've addressed the damage to your cellar entrance. Our engineering team has restored it fully." Frank thanked them, bemused by this intersection of high-level security protocols with practical farm life details. Alone in his kitchen, with Pepper at his feet, he finally processed the extraordinary sequence of events. What had begun as routine, storm preparations had escalated into a classified operation, culminating in a pending presidential visit. The morning dawned clear, the previous day's turbulent weather replaced by pristine Iowa summer conditions. Through his kitchen window, Frank observed the security preparations had advanced significantly, communications equipment established, personnel positioned strategically, and what appeared to be an impromptu helipad constructed in his east field. At precisely 8:55, the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters broke the morning stillness. 3 military aircraft appeared over the horizon, approaching in tight formation before separating as they neared the farm. Marine One descended toward the improvised landing zone, while the others maintained position overhead. Frank stood on his porch, Pepper beside him, watching security personnel establish a protective cordon from the landing zone to the farmhouse. Despite the inherent drama, he remained remarkably calm. The same steady presence that had guided him through decades of farming, military service, and yesterday's unexpected adventure. Marine One touched down with practiced precision, its rotors continuing to turn as the side door opened. The President of the United States emerged, pausing briefly to acknowledge the security team before proceeding toward the farmhouse. Frank walked down the porch steps, extending his hand as the President approached. The handshake was firm and genuine, accompanied by a smile that conveyed sincere appreciation rather than political performance. "Mr. Carson," the President greeted him, "I've been looking forward to meeting you. What you did yesterday potentially prevented a serious compromise of our national security." "Just did what needed doing, Mr. President," Frank replied with characteristic modesty. "Anyone would have." The President's expression suggested he knew better. "From what I've been told, anyone wouldn't have had the skills, knowledge, or courage to accomplish what you did. Commander Reed's report was quite specific about how essential your assistance was." Their conversation ranged from yesterday's events to broader reflections on service and duty. Throughout, the President demonstrated genuine interest in Frank's perspectives, particularly how his military training had informed his response to the situation decades later. "There's something profoundly reassuring about knowing there are people like you across this country," the President commented. "People who don't hesitate when faced with doing the right thing, even at personal risk. It's the foundation everything else is built on." As their conversation concluded, the President indicated a small case one of his aides had brought forward. "We'd like to recognize your service officially. Given the classified nature of yesterday's events, it can't be acknowledged publicly, but this comes with the sincere gratitude of a nation that will never know precisely what you did, but is safer because you did it." Inside was a medal Frank recognized despite its rarity, one of the nation's highest civilian honors, awarded only in exceptional circumstances. The accompanying certificate bore the presidential seal and his name with a citation intentionally, vague enough to maintain security while acknowledging extraordinary service. "I can't accept," Frank began, but the President raised a hand. "You can and you will," he said firmly but kindly. "Not for yourself, perhaps, but for what it represents, for the reminder that ordinary citizens doing extraordinary things is what has always made this country great." He closed the box and pressed it into Frank's hand. "Accept it with the gratitude of a nation that is safer today because of your actions." Their meeting concluded shortly thereafter, the demands of the presidential schedule requiring departure after approximately 30 minutes. As Frank stood watching Marine One lift off from his east field, he felt the weight of the past 24 hours settle into something permanent and significant. The security team began efficiently withdrawing, restoring his property to its normal state with the same precision that had characterized their arrival. By midday, the only evidence of the extraordinary visit would be the slightly flattened grass where Marine One had landed, and the medal box now resting on Frank's kitchen table. Later that evening, as the farm settled back into its familiar rhythms, Frank received one final unexpected visitor. A government vehicle approached quietly, stopping at his front gate. Commander Reed emerged, her arm properly casted but otherwise recovered significantly from her ordeal. "Mr. Carson," she greeted him as he met her on the porch, "I wanted to thank you personally before shipping out to my next assignment." "How's the arm?" Frank asked, practical concerns taking precedence over ceremony. Functional, she replied with the hint of a smile. Medical team says 6 weeks in the cast. She glanced around the farm, her expression thoughtful. I also wanted you to know that the intelligence you helped protect has already prevented a significant breach in our nuclear defense systems. 3 arrests have been made, with more pending. Frank nodded, accepting this information without pressing for classified details. Glad it worked out. You have a remarkable place here, Reed observed, her gaze taking in the fields stretching toward the horizon. I understand better now how you navigated everything so effectively yesterday. When you work the same land for decades, you develop a relationship with it that goes beyond simple familiarity. It's just home, Frank replied simply. Reed studied him for a moment. In my line of work, we spend months studying terrain before operations. You've had 40 years. That knowledge probably saved both our lives yesterday. They talked briefly about the events of the previous day, now transformed from immediate crisis to shared experience. As Reed prepared to leave, she handed Frank a small package. This is technically against protocol, she admitted, but I wanted you to have this. It's a special communications device. If you ever need anything at all, this will connect you directly to people who understand what happened. Here. Frank accepted the device with a nod of appreciation, recognizing it represented something beyond its technical capabilities. An acknowledgement that their shared experience had created a connection that transcended their different worlds. After Reed departed, Frank returned to his porch, settling into the familiar rocking chair with Pepper at his feet. The medal and communication device rested on the side table, tangible reminders of an extraordinary interlude in an otherwise ordinary life. As darkness settled over the farm, Frank contemplated the remarkable truth that had been affirmed through these events. Sometimes the most significant moments in life arise not from grand plans or deliberate choices, but simply from deciding to help someone in need during a storm. The medal would remain in its box, stored away with his military commendations. The president's visit would become a private memory, undocumented in any public record. The farm would continue as it always had. The rhythms of planting and harvest marking the passage of time. But something essential had been affirmed in Frank's understanding of the world and his place in it. The recognition that sometimes the simple choice to stop and help someone during a storm is exactly where the most meaningful journeys begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.